Welcome everyone to Ask the Expert in a Crisis, where we ask industry leaders about their unique perspective on how to navigate some of the most difficult challenges faced by the broader real estate and financial services ecosystem during the current global health crisis. Also giving you a chance to ask the expert some of the most pressing questions on your mind. My name is Max Simkoff. I'm the CEO of State's Title. And today I'm very excited to welcome Nextdoor's Chief Executive Officer, Sarah Friar, to talk about the topic, how to manage community in a crisis. I'm going to give just a quick bio on Sarah to introduce her before we begin. Sarah graduated with a master's in engineering from Oxford University and then moved to the US to get an MBA from Stanford. Out of business school, she spent 2 years at McKinsey before moving on to Goldman Sachs, where she oversaw their business unit for technology and covered stocks ranging from Microsoft and Oracle to early pioneers of software as a service like SuccessFactors and Salesforce. She brought her extensive financial expertise in-house with that last company. She joined Salesforce as SVP of Finance and then became the CFO for leading fintech payments platform Square. At Square, Sarah helped to take the company through IPO and saw their market capitalization increase to over $30 billion. And she is currently the CEO of Nextdoor, while she also serves on the boards of industry leaders Walmart and Slack. Despite her obvious success, I think a funny fact about Sarah is that she is, I believe, still considered a family disappointment because they don't understand her work, unlike her brother, who is a doctor. So.
I can't believe he even made it into this webcast. He's always there.
Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for making time for this.
Thanks, Max. My pleasure. It's great to chat.
I wanted to, let's just start at a very high level. For those who don't know, and at this point, I can't imagine there are a lot of folks because I'm actually, I've been spending some time with my parents recently, and they're on Nextdoor and use it quite frequently. But for those who don't know, can you just give us some background? What is Nextdoor, and then how is it different from the most commonly known social network, Facebook? Obviously, I think it'd be helpful to just to tee that up.
Sure. So for those of you that don't know Nextdoor, or maybe tried it a few years ago, come back, because Nextdoor is the neighborhood hub. We're there for trusted connections, so meeting people that you probably don't already know, but have something in common with you, proximity, and also for the exchange of helpful information, goods, and services. So in other words, if you need to get anything done locally, we're the place to come. Nextdoor is a little different from other social networks. So we really use this term neighborhood hub. I would say we're utility first and drive to affinity second. Ways we're different. We are a little bit of a slower growth platform because we made a decision right in the beginning that we would verify that you are that neighbor living in that neighborhood. So it's a little bit of a slower growth model than, say, Facebook, where they can take your address book and immediately all your friends are connected into their site. We knew our founders were actually really taken with a Pew Institute survey that said about a third of Americans only knew one neighbor and about a third of Americans knew 0 neighbors, which is very different from how probably the vast majority of us grew up. And so they really wanted to see, could they bring back that connected community? Could they help build social capital using technology? So that trusted connection was incredibly important. The utility aspect, very different from the graph that a Twitter or a LinkedIn or a Snapchat would have. And then finally, just our purpose in life. We're here to cultivate a kinder world where everyone has a neighborhood to rely on. And man, oh man, the last few months has certainly proven why that is needed in a time of crisis. Max, you are on mute, I think. Still have you as muted, sorry.
Sorry about that. I needed the host to unmute me.
Sign language questions.
Yeah, apologies. I was muted and I was trying to unmute, but I needed the host to unmute me. So this utility first, affinity second is really interesting. And actually, I think that this is a personal story. I used Nextdoor recently to sell something, a household good that we didn't need anymore. And it's interesting, you know, it's funny how you mentioned, like, when we don't know many of our neighbors, which unfortunately, as you mentioned, is all too common, you know, across a lot of the country, but where I live in San Francisco is, for whatever reason, more common. And actually the act of selling something and then it being hyper local, like the person who bought it lived right down the street from us. And we ended up actually having, you know, like a half an hour conversation standing in our driveway.
Mm-hmm.
And it really made me realize that there is affinity that can be created through utility, right? It was not, it was less so us finding a way to connect generally, and more like there was this like natural, you know, way of connecting to this, what was a transaction that enabled us to get to know our neighbors better. So I think that's a really,
and if I tug that thread just for a minute, I mean, this is, if you think back to how people were connected historically, they often belonged to, say, the volunteer fire department together, or they belonged to like the local Rotary Club if they were all in business together. And so it wasn't like a strong tie, like it wasn't like your relatives or your best friends. It's called weak ties in kind of, if you look at social science. But strong weak ties are incredibly important to how communities survive and thrive. And so it's exactly that in some ways you have to build some social capital. So it might be someone asks for a recommendation for a hair salon, right? I haven't had a haircut in months, but I do need one. And that person who responds, like, I'm like, oh, Max, what a nice guy. It was so good of him to give me that recommendation. Maybe we exchange something on For Sale and Free where we actually come together in real life. And then down the line, if, you know, perhaps we recognize we have very divergent opinions, at least you're kind of starting from a place of like, Max is not inherently a bad person. We just have different perspectives. And I think there's not enough of being able to kind of create social capital and create weak ties to be able to have these tougher conversations, which, you know, brings us to a lot of what we're living through today in the US, where there's just not a lot of trust across people with divergent opinions.
well, yeah, and that's actually a great transition to, I was wondering how do you build affinity then in local communities where, you know, you can have these initial ways of interacting through utility, and certainly, as you've mentioned, there's a lot of discourse on the platform around a wide range of topics beyond, you know, just utility. How do you build affinity, you know, in these local communities where that is primarily the interaction forum? It's kind of moved almost entirely online.
Yeah. So some of it is just about common interests, right? What we all share, if you're in a next door neighborhood, is locale, like proximity. And I think right now we're recognizing there's never been more power in the power of local, because we are all sheltering in place, we're working from home, right? Relationships that we might have depended on in real life when we, in my case, commuted into San Francisco, spent more time in that zone with my work colleagues, and now I'm 100% in my neighborhood. So part of building affinity is just starting with something in common. In our case, it's locality. From there, it's looking for common interests. So we build things into the product like groups, for example. So a lot of groups, if you go think about it, they tend to be very local because they usually involve some sort of in real life motion, right? Sports teams is a great example of a group. Book clubs, mothers groups. That those actually tend to stay together much longer. It's another kind of interesting thing about research that people that try to come together always virtually, often the groups don't stay together in the same way. And so we have a groups product as a way to bring people together. We also allow people to follow different topics and interests so that you find like-minded people, maybe dog walkers nearby. And then I think it's the other thing that we really try to foster on Nextdoor is civic engagement. So if you think about, again, what we have in common is local, there's often no way to talk to, say, the local mayor's office about some sort of zoning law that's coming in, right? You're working a lot in areas like real estate, and these are places where often conversations don't get raised. And in particular, it can really hurt minority groups. So it's something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment is how could we create conversation to allow people to weigh in, to allow, you know, on the other side, the mayor's office is dying to hear that feedback. People want to give it, but today you'd have to be able to show up probably for the in real life, although a lot of them not gone virtual, but the in real life once a week, you know, when the town council gets together or whatever. And for a lot of people, that's just not an option. If they're working, if they have kids, right, their lives are busy. So there's lots of ways that we attempt to bring together the affinity piece, but starting with that kind of base of utility.
Awesome. You're originally from Northern Ireland. You've spent parts of your career in continental Europe, in Africa, obviously more recently in Silicon Valley here in the US. And I know that in your current role, you have spent considerable time in communities around the world. How have you seen people's approach to community engagement differ by geography, or even through overarching local or national cultural norms? Like, what are the key differences that you've seen in people's approach to community engagement across those dimensions?
Yeah, so I'll actually start by saying, positively, and I hope it's kind of an optimistic point of view. I think the great news is that I don't think there's a place in the world where people don't value community. I grew up in a pretty tough place, right? Northern Ireland, when I was growing up, because I am that old, was at war, literally. I grew up during the Troubles. Like, my local town, you kind of asked me where I was from earlier, my local town, because I grew up in this teensy tiny little village, was literally the most bombed town of its size for about 3 decades. And that included even when, like, the Bosnian crisis was going on. So not the claim to fame most people want. So tough kind of backdrop, and yet community was just so incredibly important. Like, our village was known for the fact that we were a desegregated village, which is such a ridiculous term, but it was an important one. So what it meant is that in our case, Catholics and Protestants, because that was the two divides, all lived amongst each other. Like, our neighbors, who are still my parents' neighbors to this day, were a different religion. But we all came together, and kind of religion fell away because you had that, we were kids. We were just like in and out of each other's houses. They babysat for us, right? The whole thing. So the good news is I think there's just, people have way more in common. Now, that said, Nextdoor is in 11 countries, so we definitely do see differences emerge. And it's actually an important way that we've built the product too, is that when it comes to things like moderation, which is a very hot button in social media, we have done it at a very hyper-local level, because our belief is that someone in San Francisco in no way can understand the color and the context of a question, say in my dad's neighborhood in Northern Ireland. They would have no idea that when someone's using certain phrases, that those might not be good phrases to use, because they're very much about the local area, or vice versa. Like, one of the things I miss is good old British sarcasm. Americans probably get a little offended by it, and the Brits think it's hysterical. So you need that kind of local element. Now, in my first year at Nextdoor, I literally did go to 10 of our 11 countries. I'm kind of sad I didn't hit the 11th, because then COVID hit. And if I think about the things that I saw go on, back to your point about how do you build affinity, one topic that came up that actually made me really sad, and I've written a whole blog post on it, we just launched a whole research study on it, was loneliness. And just how much people were telling me they felt lonely. And it wasn't just like, often when you tell people, people in the community feel lonely, they kind of will hop to, oh, it must be the elderly. But it really wasn't. It was teenagers who kind of felt lonely because they see friends on other platforms where it's maybe more about how you look or what you've got in life, right? Not just who you are. We saw young moms. Like, I think about personally, like when I had my daughter and I was home for the first time, I'd always been at work, and I, totally will admit to being a little bit of a workaholic. And I really find it hard to find a tribe that I could jive with. And I felt really alone. And so I saw young mothers talking about that. I definitely saw, divorcees, and I definitely saw elderly people, maybe who'd lost a spouse. And what was incredible was how brave some of those people were, though. There was this great lunch I went to in Australia where Darlene had literally created kind of a weekly lunch. She really takes time, like everyone who shows up gets a rose that Darlene has gone and bought for them. And she kind of helps curate the conversation. Like, you're sitting eating and Darlene comes over and she's like, you have to move now. And I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, pick up your meal and go sit over there. So she moves like 20, 30 people around this table. She's actually had 2 marriage proposals, not to her, but to two couples who came to her lunch. And it was like a really across the community experience. So, I think in the end, when you boil it down from a first principles perspective, there's just so much more in common than that divides us. Now, country by country, though, you definitely see themes emerging. The US feels very different right now from what's being experienced, say, in the UK or in Denmark.
That's great. I'm curious, what was the 11th country that you weren't able to visit?
It was Italy, which
Okay.
who doesn't go
Yeah.
to Italy when they have the choice? But then I was kind of getting ready to go, and then COVID kind of started and really hurt my mojo on that one.
Yeah. Well, and so, look, 2020 has obviously been quite a year. I can't remember. I was texting with a friend last night who's at a company that has been also quite affected by a number of things going on this year. And she remarked to me, she's like, I don't know what the rest of 2020 has to offer, but I don't care what it is. I just want it to be over. Well, maybe, I mean, let's start with the big one. Like, how did COVID-19 kind of generally affect your strategy and plans for the year?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say generally Nextdoor has been very lucky in the crisis, and that it's actually very good for business. And that always feels hard when you look out on a world where people are dying and are affected the way they are. So going from February into March, we saw about an 80% lift in DAUs, daily active users on the platform, which was extraordinary, right? Just learning to cope with that, not have the site go down in and of itself was like a pretty extreme, 1-2 week period of my life where I know I had engineers who weren't even sleeping. I would look at people and you could see the weariness. I think the beginning of the pandemic for us, like in hindsight, it all kind of fits. It looks like you had this great grand plan. So I'll definitely say that as a leader, like, people are really good at revisionist history about like what they did and why they did it. And it all sounds so good. Honestly, half the time you are winging it. But, it started off, I think the first thing you could see, leaders and CEOs talking about safety and safety of their employee base, which of course was very top of mind, but frankly, for us, right, our employee base relative to the neighbors we serve, right, it's very small relative to this big neighbor base. So we really thought a lot about safety of neighborhoods. And one of the biggest things was just making sure the right information was coming from trusted sources. So we kind of moved quickly to make sure that, we were working with the CDC and the WHO, for example, or local health and human services departments. We already have a lot of public agencies on the platform. So it wasn't, you didn't have to go get new people, but we really had to help them get the right information out. For me, it's like my source every day of what's going on in my county right now is literally the health and human services that post on Nextdoor. We did a lot of work with folks like Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom here in California, the UK government, the French Ministry of Health, again, to make sure that their information was getting to the top of the feed. So that was kind of one. So information, AKA safety. The second thing we saw really quickly happen was help. And it was more in the spirit of help to give. So I think when people hit a crisis, right, a very human, natural response is, what can I do? And part of it is because humans genuinely want to give something. And a lot of it is, I think, when a really big crisis happens, you can often feel impotent, like I have no personal agency here, but just doing one small thing really can bring back a lot of mental health in times of stress. So we saw people saying, hey, I can go get groceries. Like, do you need me to go to the pharmacy for you? I can check in with an elderly neighbor. And so we wanted to make sure that we could get that help to give front and center. We actually created a product called Help Map. And then quickly, we also saw what you didn't want to have happen in a product like that was for it to become a map of the vulnerable. So you didn't want people putting themselves on a map as help needed. So that's when we created help groups where you could actually slim down even more. So you could create those one-to-one interactions, but do it again in a very safe, secure way. So kind of help was a huge theme for probably March into April. At the same time, with my background of local business, like I just knew the minute I walked out of my office and was like going to shelter in place, all I could see was like the coffee shop on the corner that I got my coffee every morning going to work and the lunch spot. And I'm like, those things are not going to survive, right? This is a CBD, a central business district, as I learned about in my geography class when I was 16. And like, if people are not showing up to work, they have no customers. So what are we going to do for local businesses? So we've done a massive push around local businesses because we can see on the platform neighbors saying, hey, I want to help. And they, originally it was donations, then it was like, are you doing pickup or delivery? And now it's like, how do I shop safe? We just did a whole campaign with the state of California on shop safe, shop local, because we can see that neighbors want to do that. And then the final thing that actually just launched today, and I'm not meaning to do like a product shout out, but you mentioned it, so I'm going to go for it, but is nonprofits. So the other group that I think no one's talking a lot about is nonprofits. And they're often the safety nets of our community. Like think about the homeless shelter or the Humane Society. Small businesses are always like on the knife edge of like cash flow, and nonprofits are over the knife edge. Yeah. Like 50% of them only have 3 months of working capital, 20% of them only have 1 month. And so without an ability to raise money, particularly since many of them raise money through things that happen in real life, like a sponsored run or goodwill you go give clothes to, they're really, really in tough shape. So we launched something called Sell for Good really quickly. If you want to put something for sale, like whatever you sold on our classifieds page, you can now put all the proceeds to a nonprofit.
Oh, wow.
And we'll, on the back end, it connects to PayPal accounts because we're using the PayPal Giving Fund. But we think it's a really great grassroots way because we know people are cleaning out their garage, not their garage, their garage, that's my Northern Irish accent. They're cleaning out their spare bedrooms. They want to give, and this allows for a very grassroots way to give. So it's a long way to say that I would say COVID has really sped up our business. And the leadership challenge has been much more about how do we not redline people, and how do we make sure we're not doing spurious things that actually don't have longevity? Like how do we make sure it would still be part of the arc of how we would grow the company, even if we're doing 2 years of work in kind of 6 months?
That's wow. And so what a cool new feature. I will probably use it.
Yeah, my husband, literally my daughter has all these American Girl toys that we've kept, God knows why, because she's a teenager. And so we just told her, we're like, hey, I've got a way for you to give back. And so she's like on there right now trying to pick her charitable organization. So I think even for kids, it's a great way to teach them about philanthropy.
It is. Actually, I have a 6-year-old daughter who might be interested in buying those American Girl toys. We could complete the circle.
Totally. For you, I got a special deal. 100% higher.
I have one more question I wanted to ask, and then I want to leave a few minutes for a Q&A. I've seen a few come across, and again, if anybody would like to ask a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The last question I want to make sure and ask here, Sarah, is something that actually over the years I have sought a lot of advice from you about leadership in general through a variety of situations. Certainly this year has thrown a number of new challenges your way as a leader of a large organization, and as somebody who helps leaders like myself and leaders at other big companies and small tech companies navigate very challenging waters. So what has been your most important learning as a leader this year, given the current environment?
Yeah, so I don't know if they're brand new learnings, but they just always get underscored. So when I think about my leadership this year, the 2 words that keep coming to mind are transparency and empathy. I think as a leader, I've always erred into being a very transparent leader to begin with. Like some might say an oversharer. So anyone who's worked with me on the comm side, their job is usually to pull Sarah back because I love to share. But I think it's really important in times of stress that people know that, what's happening. And honestly, until you're sick of saying it, most people can't hear what you're saying. So you really have to over communicate through every channel available to you. Now, most leaders are thinking about it in the context of their company, and I really think about it in the context of our customer base. And I have, a lot of we have 266,000 neighborhoods, right? It's a big challenge to figure out how to get communication out to all those folks to let them know what is going on and why we're doing certain things. The second point on transparency, and they're very interrelated. Again, I just feel you always do better when there's full transparency. I had an old head of comms that used to always say, tell the truth because you won't forget it. And so, I think again, they kind of go hand in glove. So even within my company, for example, we share our board materials right before they go to the board, they go to the company. I just am very transparent about anything that's going on. Again, because that's how you bring the best minds to the table. Like, why would you close the aperture of who knows about a problem when opening it, you may get far more diverse orthogonal ideas on how to solve a particular problem. So those two words have really struck me. I mean, personally as a leader, I always say people first is my mantra. Like, get your people right, everything else just works. So you do have to take the time. I do my people-oriented things early in the morning because it's when my brain is at its best. That's a mantra I kind of carried from my dad, frankly. He's a really big people person. And then I think what's become clear in a crisis is the need for purpose. People need something more than just rallying around kind of a commercial intent. I think they need to believe there's a purpose behind why they're doing something. Purpose-driven companies, I think, can kind of keep going even when the going gets really tough, and staying true to that purpose. So certainly lots of learning, lots of mistakes. But I think the key is just being honest when you do make a mistake. And that goes back to kind of the communication and the transparency piece.
Definitely. And I think you mentioned earlier in our discussion the revisionist history that leaders oftentimes do, when looking back on, we did these things and we did them intentionally and we had planned for them and that's why it went this way. And more often than not, you're kind of winging it as you go. But I think I've certainly also learned that if you're winging it, which is the only thing you can do when things are as dynamic as they are right now, and you are being transparent, then it's much better than figuring it out and not explaining to people that you are figuring it out. You get a lot of leeway by just telling people that you are figuring it out and asking them to help.
Right.
Okay, so I've got a few questions, but I think we've got time for maybe one. And the best one that I've seen that's very relevant certainly to our business is this one. It says, given the flux we're seeing in the housing market, current conditions have driven people to question their home location choices and look towards the suburbs, especially those with families. There is also a greater demand for homes with dedicated office space. What other housing market trends have you seen emerge or accelerate at this time? And I'm guessing they may have meant, what trends have you seen on the platform?
Yeah. It's a great question. And we do spend a lot of time, as you can imagine, working with, for example, real estate agents or mortgage brokers and so on, because they're core to a neighborhood, right? I always say that, real estate agents don't sell a house, they're selling a home. They're not selling a school district, they're selling a sense of belonging, right? You all know that, so I'm just telling you your business at the moment. We have seen a lot of those trends. Like, we actually do an insights report. If you kind of search on LinkedIn or whatever, we put them out there. We've done 2, our 3rd is coming up in August. And we've definitely seen that local is very, very top of mind. But even within the home, people are getting creative. So home gym, 27% of our neighbors said in our most recent survey that they were exercising at home more frequently. And I know for sure in For Sale and Free, I had an elliptical to sell and I had like 40 people who wanted that elliptical. And the person who took it, I don't know how they got it in their car, but they were not leaving without it. We definitely see a lot of posts around home offices. And again, people being creative. They're looking for the stand-up desk. I highly recommend, by the way, for your health and just your mental well-being. A lot of right now, big pushes around home patio is really top of mind. Grills, barbecues. Yes, we always see this conversation on Nextdoor, but it's like double its normal level. And then even around things like gear, like I was talking to someone yesterday about fishing gear. I will admit I sit on the board of Walmart, as you know, and they were like, fishing gear has come alive again. Who knew? Because if you think about people want to be outdoors, they want to be further from people. And so sports that are allowing kind of people to be more distanced. But yeah, I think people are really rethinking, do they want to be in that urban area that's very dense? And we are definitely seeing a lot of shifts out into suburbia and even beyond. Like, I think people for the first time contemplating, yeah, I could go live wherever, because in many cases we have the privilege of being able to work from home.
Definitely. Yeah, no, and it's gonna, it will be It will be fascinating and probably very exciting for you and the business to be the fabric that accommodates a lot of, you know, the transitions that we're probably going to see. I think having that sense of community will be important now more than ever. We're a little over on time, so I really appreciate you making time for this, Sarah. This has been so wonderful. I always enjoy speaking with you, and this time being no exception. I've learned some things that I'm going to apply to how we manage our business and also how I interact with my community. So I wanted to thank you again for making the time for it. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. Love what you guys are doing. I think States Title is an amazing company. Come so far in a very short period of time. So I always learn a lot too. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.